This season of the Cold Podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please, take care in listening.
I called about Crime Stoppers, the number.
Crime Stoppers?
Weber County Sheriff's Dispatcher Shelly Mann took a call just after noon on April 3rd, 1987.
I remember getting a call from an anonymous caller.
I'm reporting a body that I found.
A body?
Yeah, a body that I just happened across way up, it's way out, it's not in the community or anything, it's way out in the hills.
He was pretty vague.
Is it in Weber County?
It's over there by Causey Reservoir.
He couldn't really describe it because it was in a remote area, and you would have to have a special map to find it.
Can I get your name?
No, I'm not interested in leading search warrants.
You won't give me your name?
I'm just reporting, no, of course not. I didn't have anything to do with it,
He didn't want to give me his name and number, so I asked him if he could hold on for just a minute, and I put him on hold, and I was trying to find somebody, but there was nobody in the building. By the time I got back to him, he had hung up.
Shelly was 23, a couple of years into what would become a lifelong career as a dispatcher.
And I remember so many calls over the years that still stick with me. I feel like I have PTSD from a lot of calls.
This call wasn't on that list, at least not until Shelly heard it for the first time in more than 30 years in Season 2 of this podcast.
It's a little bit odd hearing my own voice after that many years. A little bit strange.
She hadn't realized searchers never found the body.
And this one now will hang on to me forever, wishing I could have done more.
The anonymous caller made 2 calls to police that day. The first went to Roy City Police, who were at that time investigating the disappearance of Sheree Warren. Maybe the anonymous caller knew Roy Police were looking for Sheree. Maybe he lived in Roy. Or maybe it was just coincidence. The man didn't mention Sheree by name, and the dispatcher, realizing the body was outside Roy's city boundaries, not Roy Police's jurisdiction, told the man to instead call the Weber County Sheriff's Office. That's how he had ended up talking to Shelly.
That was a long time ago.
Weber County mobilized its search and rescue team to look for the body in the days that followed, but they weren't able to go far into the mountains around Causey because winter snow still covered the high country. Their search came up empty. In the last season of Cold, we explored how this anonymous phone call influenced the search for another missing Weber County woman, Joyce Yost. But in this episode, we're going to hear why evidence I've since uncovered strongly suggests the body more likely belonged to Sheree Warren. This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 4, The Supper Club. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. One day after, the anonymous caller reported finding a body in the mountains east of Ogden. An Ogden woman received an odd phone call of her own.
Hi, I'm calling to conduct a survey in an attempt to find some answers about the woman of the 80s. Is she taller, shorter, thinner, heavier, etc.?
This is a recreation based on what the woman told police the caller said.
We feel it's important to ask her and get her feelings and opinions about the lifestyle she is living in the 80s.
The caller rattled off questions about family and fashion before turning to lingerie, anatomy, and sexual preferences. Another woman received a similar call the next day and another a week later. Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman saw those calls going out from Cary Hartmann's phone thanks to the pen register he had placed on Cary's line. The pen register wasn't a wiretap. It didn't record the audio of those calls, but it did log every number dialed. Zimmerman declined an interview for this podcast, but I've obtained his reports and personal notes from this case. Here's what he wrote about it.
Within a day of the numbers being recorded on the tape, I have called several of the numbers that were called. All ladies contacted state they did receive a magazine survey at the time listed on the tape, and all say the questions are the same wording dealing with female clothing, the female body, and sex.
At the start of May, a woman named Teresa received one of those survey calls. She remained on the line through Cary's questions, even the explicit ones. They agreed to meet for drinks at Sebastian's, the same bar Cary had visited the night Sheree Warren disappeared. Zimmerman believed Cary had gone through the phone book, picking female names and calling them at random. He took his findings to Weber County Attorney Reed Richards.
There were phone records that showed that he had made literally thousands of those types of calls, which was pretty bizarre.
Literally thousands of lingerie survey phone calls. We'll never know the total number, but police wrote in an average month during 1986, Cary had made between 500 and 600 lingerie survey calls. Keep up that pace for a year, and you'd be looking at more than 6,000 phone calls.
Talking to women about all sorts of goofy topics.
Goofy to Reed, terrifying to many of the women. One of those women spoke to Detective Chris Zimmerman. She told him she had recognized the survey caller's voice. He was Cary Hartmann. They had dated several years before, and she had heard him making lingerie survey calls back then. She had been around Cary one time in '86 and had fished in his coat pocket while he wasn't looking. He had carried a small black book full of names and phone numbers, along with notes about how various women had responded to the survey questions.
It tends to indicate probably a guy that's perverted, and that's, I think, what he was.
Prosecutor Reed Richards was well aware of the rash of home invasion rapes that had rocked Ogden City for more than 2 years. Detective Chris Zimmerman told Reed he could tie Cary Hartmann to at least a handful of those rapes.
They were fairly unique. They all involved young women, usually 19 to 25. They were all women that were not with their husband, either separated or never been married. They all had young children. He would threaten to hurt or kill the child if the woman made any noise, and he claimed to have access to police records, and that if they went to the police, he said he'd know and he'd come back and kill the child.
The time had come to pull Cary in for questioning.
So we had to strategize the best way to try to deal with that.
Cary still had friends within the ranks of the Ogden Police Department from his time in the reserves.
We decided we'd find somebody that kind of knew him from his association with the police, and that was a good interrogator and a fairly congenial guy, and so we landed on Chris Zimmerman.
Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman, the guy who'd once issued a phony parking ticket to President Ronald Reagan. Zimmerman called Roy Police Detective Jack Bell, who was leading the investigation into Sheree Warren's disappearance. Zimmerman briefed Jack on the new evidence that suggested Cary Hartmann had been making hundreds of lingerie survey phone calls.
Exactly, and been going on for quite a while.
And Zimmerman believed Cary could be the Ogden City Rapist. Jack told Zimmerman he had started to suspect Cary had killed Sheree Warren.
I'm still looking at Chuck,
But Jack hadn't found any direct evidence linking Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, to her disappearance. So Jack
shifted gears from Chuck to Cary.
Detectives Jack Bell and Chris Zimmerman agreed to work together. They came up with a plan. Zimmerman would call Cary into Ogden Police Headquarters for an interview. While he was there, Jack and the other detectives would serve a search warrant at Cary's apartment. They would use the lingerie survey phone calls as grounds for the warrant. But while in the apartment, the detectives would keep an eye out for anything that might tie Cary to the rapes or the suspected murder of Sheree Warren. In an odd twist, Cary called Ogden Police himself the night before the detectives were to execute this plan. He phoned OPD to report his own case of telephone harassment. According to a police report, Cary said he had received a rash of eerie phone calls. Cary was then dating a woman named Shauna. An anonymous source would later tell police Cary and Shauna had met through one of his lingerie survey calls. Shauna had started seeing Cary despite still being married to a man named Roger Hall. Court records show Shauna filed for divorce from Roger in January of '87, and it had not gone smoothly. Roger filed a $500,000 civil lawsuit against Cary, accusing him of seducing Shauna into infidelity. The bad blood between Roger and Cary simmered for months. Cary believed Roger and his girlfriend's brother-in-law, a guy named Melvin Feller, had both been calling his home phone and hanging up in an effort to annoy and intimidate him. He told an Ogden police officer he might just go take care of Roger himself, physically, if the police wouldn't do anything. The officer urged Cary not to do anything rash. Cary had gone to work the next morning and at noon stopped by a burger joint for lunch with 2 coworkers. Melvin Feller just happened to be there. Cary pulled out a pen and paper and started jotting notes, presumably to provide to police.
I was writing down his plate number when he said something smart-assed. I walked over to him and I said, "Don't mess with me."
These are Cary's notes, read by a voice actor.
He said, "Shauna and you will never have anything."
Cary had allegedly replied, quote, "See you dead."
I walked away. He provoked me again by saying something crude. He called me a pervert and adulterer.
Melvin told police he had called Cary a child molester. He reportedly said Cary had responded, quote, "I don't molest children, I only molest women."
I again said, "Melvin, leave me alone."
Detectives' notes say Melvin said Cary told him, quote, "You don't know how easy it is to kill somebody." Melvin left the restaurant. As he drove away, he shouted back, "See ya, Cary Hartmann."
The man is a nut, very childlike.
Later that evening, Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman dropped by Cary's apartment. He asked Cary to come down to police headquarters to talk out the whole situation with Roger Hall and Melvin Feller, the two guys Cary believed had bombarded him with harassing telephone calls. But when Cary arrived at Ogden Police Headquarters, Zimmerman instead confronted him about the lingerie survey calls. Here's what Zimmerman wrote in his report.
He admitted to making these calls, stating it was a problem he had and it was a sexual problem, and he'd been making the calls for over 7 years.
Zimmerman brought up one of the rapes. He told Cary about the woman, who I'm calling Danielle, who had remembered meeting him at the sewing machine repair shop, who had later recognized his voice while at the bar where he worked, the Galleon.
I asked if he did do the sexual assault, and he denied it. Hartmann stated he had no idea where he was at the time, but he had never raped anyone. He couldn't stand the word rape and would never think of raping anyone.
Zimmerman asked if Cary would take a polygraph. He said he would. So the detective drove Cary to a nearby testing facility. A polygraph examiner hooked him up to the machine and asked if he had ever raped anyone, if he had entered Danielle's home. Cary answered no. The examiner said Cary's physical reactions indicated deception.
I asked if he would like to take another test, and he stated yes. Hartmann was allowed to leave, and I advised him I would set up another test.
A short time later, Zimmerman received a phone call. Cary had arrived home to find his apartment trashed. While he had been away, Jack Bell and a pair of Ogden detectives had served their search warrant. They had taken Cary's little black book, a day planner, and a Playboy calendar. He was furious.
I explained they had to search the entire house, and they were careful, but it causes messes sometimes. Hartmann stated, "I feel like I've just been raped," and he hung up the phone.
Cary returned to Ogden Police Headquarters on the morning of Friday, May 8th for his second polygraph. Zimmerman had arranged to have an outside agency conduct the second test. He drove Cary to neighboring Davis County, where a sheriff's deputy was standing by. They did 3 runs through. The results again showed deception, and much more strongly this time. That's probably because the deputy tossed in a new question. Had Cary asked Danielle if she was 16 years old while having sex with her?
This was something only the victim, the police department, and the suspect would have access to. It was never released to the media.
Cary denied ever having asked anyone their age during sex. He said he didn't know Danielle and had never had any sexual contact with her. In a report, the deputy said in his opinion, Cary was, quote, being deceptive in his answers. With the polygraph done, Detective Zimmerman faced a crossroads. He didn't have enough for an arrest, so he could cut Cary loose or try to turn up the heat. But to do that, he would need help. Because Zimmerman and Cary knew one another from Cary's time in the police reserve, it made sense for Zimmerman to play good cop. So he introduced Cary to bad cop, a detective Cary didn't know named John Stubbs.
John Stubbs. A good detective. No two ways about it.
Jack Bell told me Stubbs was an old-school cop, abrasive and intimidating. Stubbs died in 2017, so I wasn't able to interview him.
But he was a very good detective. Could read people really well.
Stubbs grilled Cary for 4 hours. I wish I could play you audio of that, but it doesn't exist. Ogden Police just didn't record their interviews back in the 80s. The best we've got is a report Detective Stubbs wrote a couple weeks later. It says Stubbs asked Cary why he'd failed the polygraph. Cary reportedly said he didn't know. Stubbs said, "You failed because you lied during the test." Stubbs wrote, Hartmann, losing his temper now, said, "Okay, it made me remember some things about..." At this point, his eyes got rather large, and he seemed to suddenly realize what he was saying and stopped himself mid-sentence. I said, "It made you remember some things that you don't really want to remember, didn't it?" Hartmann would not respond to that at all. Chris Zimmerman observed the interrogation through a pane of mirrored glass.
Hartmann stated he didn't have to rape girls. He stated that he's gone to houses and girls will let him in, and then he would talk them into sex, but he never had to force anyone.
It wasn't quite an admission. Zimmerman wasn't sure what to do. Once Stubbs had finished, Zimmerman took Cary to his car and started driving back toward Ogden Police Headquarters.
About 2 minutes after I started driving, Hartmann said to me that he wanted me to know he didn't rape anyone. I asked why he was remembering the part about the 16-year-old, and he stated he wasn't sure. He was trying to answer, and he wanted to tell me. At this time, it appeared Hartmann wanted to confess but couldn't do it. I advised Hartmann that I felt he couldn't confess because in his mind, Cary Hartmann didn't do it, that another personality in Hartmann was making him do this. I then asked if that was possible, and he said yes.
It seems a little strange for Zimmerman to have suggested this split personality idea out of the blue. But remember, he was playing good cop. By suggesting another personality had done the deed, Zimmerman was giving Cary an opportunity to say what had happened without taking responsibility. They hadn't quite made it back to Ogden Police Headquarters when Zimmerman suggested they drive by Danielle's house to see if it might jog Cary's memory.
I stopped at the stop sign at 2450 Custer. Hartmann stated, "This is it. This is real familiar." He said, "This is scary, Chris."
They pulled up to the curb.
I asked him to tell me how he got in, and he said it was a window. He stated he pulled off a screen and the window was unlocked, so he went in. He stated he went in and laid on the bed beside the girl.
I won't repeat the specific details of the assault, but Zimmerman wrote everything Cary said was fairly accurate compared to what Danielle had described.
Hartmann stated that he really felt the girl enjoyed this, so he didn't feel he was forcing it. When I advised him that she probably didn't fight because she was so scared, he said, "Oh, great," as if he was sad and disappointed.
Cary reportedly admitted he had first seen Danielle at his friend Dave Moore's sewing machine repair shop.
I asked how he got her address, and he stated he was good with numbers, and he remembered everything.
They went to OPD headquarters. Zimmerman sat Cary down, and they went through it again.
I then advised Cary that there were several other sexual assaults in the area around his house on 7th Street, and I felt he did them. Cary immediately asked if he had hurt anyone. He stated he couldn't remember details. He wanted to, but couldn't.
Cary reportedly said he sometimes woke up exhausted in the morning because he would go out walking or driving at 3 or 4 a.m. Zimmerman knew many of the rapes had occurred around 4 a.m.
I asked how many times he had woke up in the morning and knew he had done something wrong to another girl, and he stated, "A half-dozen times or more, Chris."
Zimmerman wrote, quote, "I questioned him on threatening the children. He wouldn't deny it. He just stated he would never hurt a child, that he loves his children."
He stated he was always nice and gentle, and he used to have a problem with beating his first wives, but he was over that.
Zimmerman decided to take Cary out for another drive. He cruised by several of the victims' homes. I don't have time to go through them all, but we'll highlight this one.
I asked if he remembered any other girls, and he said there was a pretty blonde he always saw at Quick Mart. I pointed to Car Quick at 7th and Washington and asked if that is where he saw the blonde. He said yes, and stated she lived right up the street.
This woman, who I'm calling Caroline, lived near Cary's old apartment on Ogden's 7th Street. Zimmerman pulled the car around the block from the convenience store.
As I turned, he pointed to the red brick duplex on the corner and told me she lived there. He then pointed to the correct door of the duplex. When I asked which door, he then stated the curtains were open and I could see her.
Zimmerman remembered having seen footprints in a flower bed in front of that same window the morning after the rape.
We felt at the time the suspect had looked through the window. He said he went in through the front door because it was unlocked, and he turned off the TV because of the light. He stated he kneeled beside the couch and started to kiss her, and it frightened her, so he told her, "I didn't mean to scare you."
Again, I won't repeat the details of the sexual assault itself. It's only important to know Cary's description mostly aligned with what Caroline had told police. She thought her attacker had come through the back door, not the front.
Hartmann stated that the girl really didn't resist, that she really liked it.
They returned to OPD headquarters around 5:30 p.m. Zimmerman left Cary with his boss, Captain Marlon Balls, for a few minutes. Balls wrote in a report Cary seemed concerned his friends would think he was a real sleazeball. He acted grateful Zimmerman hadn't treated him like a, quote, dirtbag. Cary's friends included a lot of guys within the OPD ranks. He was actually planning on joining Balls, Zimmerman, and others on a hunting trip to Idaho in a matter of days. Balls assured him it would just be a matter of time before this was all over. Zimmerman returned and told Cary they were taking one more drive. This time, it was to the Weber County Jail. He booked Cary on suspicion of 2 counts each of aggravated sexual assault and burglary for the attacks on Danielle and Caroline. The following morning, a judge set Cary's bail at $30,000. Cary's girlfriend, Shauna Hall, and his parents got a bail bondsman to put up the cash. He was out of jail in less than 24 hours. Cary arrived home at his apartment Saturday evening to find a message on his machine. It was from Teresa, the woman he'd placed a lingerie survey call to a week earlier and then met for drinks. Teresa would later tell a detective she went to Cary's apartment around 10:30 that night and found him, quote, depressed. He didn't mention having been arrested, saying only, quote, everything finally came to a head. Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner, one of the investigators on the Ogden City Rapist case, hosted a briefing for detectives of the Salt Lake City Police Department's Missing and Murdered Women Task Force on the morning of Monday, May 11th, 1987. Shane and his colleagues had kept their information about Cary Hartmann off the books for months.
That information we were working off of was kept pretty close. There was 2 or 3 of us that knew about it.
Now, Shane opened up. He gave the Salt Lake detectives each a sheet with Cary's mugshot and a description of his truck, that not-so-pretty yellow Chevy pickup. The sheet said Cary owned a .357 Magnum revolver and was known to walk the streets at night. It said he should be considered unstable and unpredictable. Salt Lake police had 3 unsolved murders of young women they had tied by ballistics to a single gun, a .38. A .357 can fire 38 rounds. But the Salt Lake detectives didn't believe Cary was their serial killer.
They just kind of discounted it because it was a little different than the other cases they were actively working.
Still, Shane asked the Salt Lake detectives to keep their eyes open. He told them the victims in the Ogden City Rapist cases feared Cary might try to find them.
They didn't want him coming after him, so they all moved. Some of them moved as soon as they came to the police, but a whole lot more of them moved once he was picked up and charged.
Weber County Attorney Reed Richards filed a series of formal charges against Cary that week in connection with 4 of the rape cases. Cary remained a suspect in many more, but Reed focused on only those with the strongest evidence, with victims who seemed willing to endure the awful task of testifying.
You know, there's no 2 ways to look at it. If you have to go through a preliminary hearing that is open to the public and openly reported on, these aren't kids, and so they can report names and what they say, the whole works. And then you've got to wait a few months, many months probably, and then go through the trial and do the same thing. That's why the last numbers I saw were maybe 70% of women don't even want to report.
The most recent numbers from the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics are from 2020. They say 77% of rape or sexual assault victims don't report the crimes to police.
Because they don't want to go through that. And of those that do report, a lot of them back out midway through the process because they think, gee, this is just not worth it.
The charges included aggravated sexual assault, a crime more serious than rape under Utah law because it included the use of force or threat of harm. Reed wanted Cary off the streets. Adding 2 new cases allowed him to secure an arrest warrant. Ogden police went and found Cary on Tuesday, May 12th, and tossed him back in jail. The additional charges also significantly upped Cary's bail to $105,000.
Which in whatever it was, 87 or 88, was a ton of money. It still is.
Reed feared if Cary managed to get out again ahead of trial, it might spook the women he had attacked into recanting. At the time, Utah didn't have a law that would have allowed Cary to be held without bail. Reed hoped $100,000 would be enough. The criminal charges caught the attention of reporters.
It made a big splash in the news media, and especially in the Ogden Standard.
The newspaper published a story about Cary's arrest that week.
And we received a lot of different calls referring to him.
Detective Shane Miner heard from women who described having had contact with Cary in the past.
And what they would describe would be a date rape type of situation, or where they had gone out with him for a period of time, had stopped, and then he would show back up and take advantage of them.
Shane talked to Jan, the divorcee who had loaned Cary money for his truck back in the fall of '84. I described Jan's brief relationship with Cary in episode 1. She told Shane the story of how Cary had dragged her into a closet on the Weber State College campus after she had broken up with him.
Just how he treated them was horrible.
Shane's notes say Jan told him she had not reported being raped back then because she had feared no one would believe her.
They had gone out with him, and he could take advantage of them and didn't worry about any repercussions because they had been dating, and so who's going to believe them? And at the same time, he's basically abusing them.
Some of the women described this kind of activity taking place at Cary's apartment. Word of that got back to Roy Police Detective Jack Bell, the lead investigator on the Sheree Warren case.
I wouldn't call it a shock. I might have been a little surprised, but I wouldn't call it a shock. It was enough to make us go back and talk to the ladies again.
By ladies, he means 2 women who had lived above Cary at the time of Sheree Warren's disappearance.
And we got a completely different story from them this time.
Cary had rented the basement of a house on Ogden's 7th Street from May of '84 through November of '86. The house belonged to a woman who had taught at Ogden High School named Kaylin. She lived upstairs along with another renter, a fellow teacher named Mary.
2 school teachers.
Jack told me he had interviewed Kaylin and Mary once before, over the phone, prior to Cary's arrest.
They couldn't tell us too much the first time I talked to them.
But he talked to them again the day after Cary's return to jail.
The second time, they claimed that the night Sheree disappeared, she was actually there. And they recall hearing a loud thump. And then all went quiet.
Jack had Kaylin and Mary each provide typewritten statements about what they remembered. I have copies of those, and I've also spoken with both women. Their statements from '87 are more detailed than their memories now, so for this podcast, we're going to focus on what they wrote. We'll start with Kaylin, her exact words read by a voice actor.
Cary Hartmann came to interview for my rental apartment in the basement of my house and was, in the most part, an excellent renter.
Here's Mary, again through a voice actor.
He did not pay his rent on time, which caused a problem with relations with the landlord.
The one thing I hate about my house is how easy it is to hear the back door close, or people going up and down the stairs. It inevitably would wake us.
Cary always had a girlfriend or 2 around. You could hear them downstairs, laughing or watching TV.
The really objectionable part of Cary was his constant sexual activity. Obnoxious to me because he'd invariably come home drunk and loud with a girlfriend and entertain them for a few hours sometimes, or overnight, or whatever.
The noise was embarrassingly noticeable. So loud were the screams that once I thought they came from a lady next door or something.
Occasionally, one close girlfriend would come unannounced and catch him with another, and there would be a fight, if he'd answered the door.
At one time, he had 2 steadies. One girl was a blonde. I never talked to her, but she stayed overnight a few times. The other girl was Sheree Warren.
She was a bit younger than the rest, but seemed very level-headed, higher class than he usually brought here. very embarrassed if I ever met her in the driveway as she was leaving.
The first time I met her was in the summer of 1985. It was a weekend morning. I had slept in and a knock came to the front door. She asked me if Cary was home, and I said, if he doesn't answer, he's not.
Usually, she parked by the telephone pole in front of the house. So we got used to her car and who she was.
The last time I saw Sheree Warren was an October night in 1985.
Cary was home that evening. Unusual. I don't remember anything in particular that night until I had gone to bed at my usual 10:30 or so.
A car pulled up. I sat up and pulled the curtain open to see who it was. I saw Sheree's car. It was parked out in front of the house. She knocked and knocked again. He got up and walked upstairs. She was crying when she said she needed to talk to him.
As they went downstairs, an argument ensued. This was a king-sized one.
I could hear them through a vent in the hallways, as clear as if it were in the next room. I got off the couch and said to Kaylin that she had caught him with another woman and to come hear them.
I could hear them just fine from bed. I'd never heard Sheree upset before, but she was saying things like, "How could you be with someone else? You lied to me."
She said people at work had told her that they had seen him with another woman. She asked Cary how he could do that after all she had done for him with his money problems and all.
Cary was really yelling back at her. He said, "Hey babe, I don't owe you anything."
I could hear her crying, and I left the vent and said to Kaylin, "Did you hear that? He's putting it all back on her." I went back to the vent, and that's when I heard what I thought was him hitting the wall really hard with his fist. Then he said, "Shh."
I don't recall any more sobbing, but the fight stopped.
I went back to the couch and just sat there.
I have no recollection of her leaving that night. I don't remember hearing anyone go up the stairs.
The next morning, I went to go out to work as usual, but I can't say if the car was there or not.
Mary and I commented about the fight that next morning, but really forgot about it until the newspaper came out with the news that Sheree was missing 2 or 3 days after the fight.
I saw an article in the paper which stated Sheree was missing, and it mentioned Cary Hartmann had reported her missing. He hadn't mentioned a thing to us. I wrote a short note and stuck it on his door saying how sorry we were that this had happened, and if we could help, let us know.
He responded as soon as he came home and said that Sheree had plans to drive to Salt Lake and meet her ex-husband to work out something about the settlement or whatever, and that he'd been busy doing something that evening and naturally didn't expect her back. Then, when she didn't show up, he had gotten really worried because the ex had been bad to her.
He told us at that time that he was sure it was her ex-husband. He took the following days off for aiding the police in the search for Sheree, he told me.
He asked us to take some flyers and put them up at work. Very soon thereafter, he said something about deer or elk hunting and that he and his friends were going to go. Lewis, for KSL Northern Area News, was his most common buddy that he did things with that we saw.
He looked really terrible the following week. He was quiet and withdrawn. He didn't have any more girlfriends after Sheree.
I had a very suspicious feeling about Cary when we heard Sheree had disappeared. In fact, Mary and I had talked about not being surprised if they found he had done it.
He got a job at the Galleon, and so he took very late hours. But some nights he would come in at 2, 3, or 4 a.m. and get up and go to work at 6:30. I wondered how he did it. He decided to move out in the fall of 1986. He was going to move into a condo. We figured he met a rich girlfriend and was moving in with her because he couldn't make a $190 payment here.
We were doing the yard and house fall cleaning and came upon a box in my storage room that Cary had left. It was a full box of the flyers that Cary had printed with Sheree's picture and the reward that was offered for information. None were missing. The box was packed tight.
There were hundreds of them. We talked about if we should call the police, but he had been so convincing about how he felt about losing her.
He had told us that he'd spent hours and hours posting these all over the area. That box had never been opened.
Two women who had lived above Cary Hartmann in October of '85 had told Detective Jack Bell they had heard a loud argument between Cary and Sheree Warren, followed by a thump. But were they sure it had happened the same night Sheree disappeared? Jack told me yes.
I said Sheree was there that day.
But his notes from the time are a bit more nuanced. They say one of the women, Mary, remembered this fight between Cary and Sheree taking place 2 days before the first newspaper report on Sheree's disappearance. The other woman, Kaylin, said 2 or 3 days. And that little bit of ambiguity was a problem.
I think if those girls that he rented the house from would have come forward originally with that story, we might have got to the bottom of it quicker.
So why didn't they? Well, there are 2 potential answers. The first and most obvious, they didn't feel safe speaking up until
Cary Hartmann had been arrested as a rapist.
This makes perfect sense. The second possible reason boiled down to an issue of ego. Mary would years later tell an investigator she had reported the fight between Cary and Sheree to a Roy police officer, but not Jack Bell, soon after it had happened.
That surprises me.
I know the name of the officer. Jack told me he and that officer never got along, and it's possible this kept Mary's tip from making it to Jack in the first few days after Sheree Warren disappeared. If not for that conflict of ego, the entire direction of Jack's investigation might have changed.
Especially if it would have come early. Damn.
As it was, the information arrived a year and a half late, after Cary had lawyered up and was no longer available to Jack for questioning.
Had no more contact with him.
On the same day Jack had talked to Cary's former neighbors, he had also heard from one of Cary's old friends.
How about Fred Johns?
Fred Johns. Yeah, Fred was a little flaky.
I've mentioned Fred before.
And he knew Cary.
Fred's the guy Cary had briefly lived with during the mid-'70s, between his 2 marriages. But as mentioned in episode 1, Fred had kicked Cary out of his house after Cary put the moves on Fred's wife. Fred was leasing hunting rights on a chunk of mountain property between Causey and Lost Creek reservoirs when Sheree Warren disappeared a decade later. I previously made a metaphor to help you picture the geography around this area. It looks like a percent sign, 2 small circles separated by a diagonal slash. Causey's the circle in the upper left, Lost Creek's the circle in the lower right, and the mountain between them is the diagonal slash. There's a dirt road that runs along that mountain, linking the 2 reservoirs, following the slash. The property where Fred Johns held hunting rights sat on that dirt road, at the top of the mountain. He had a cabin up there, near a canyon called Gildersleeve.
Fred's camp was at the head of Gilder, but off a little ways, wasn't down right on the ridge.
Fred died in 2019, so I wasn't able to interview him. But he did talk to Jack Bell after learning of Cary's arrest.
Let's put it this way. Fred was fairly cooperative.
Jack's memory of this conversation was a bit faded, so I'm going to draw from notes he made at the time.
It's a good thing I made some notes. They're better than I thought I made.
They say Fred described having seen Cary on the boundary of Fred's leased property the Sunday after Sheree disappeared. Fred said he had been driving that dirt road on the mountain between Causey and Lost Creek when he had seen Cary's truck, that ugly yellow Chevy.
He knew Cary, so he knew who he was when he seen him up there.
It was the opening weekend of Utah's elk hunt, and Fred was patrolling for trespassers. He had found Cary and another man, Fred thought it was Cary's younger brother Jack Hartmann, loading a pair of 3-wheelers into the back of Cary's pickup. Fred told Detective Jack Bell he had asked Cary what he was up to. Cary had supposedly told Fred he was breaking camp after hunting for elk down toward Causey. This hadn't made much sense to Fred for 2 reasons. First, he had never known Cary to hunt elk, only deer and birds. Second, Fred had driven past that same spot the night prior and hadn't seen Cary's truck there. Fred also had not seen any rifles during this encounter with Cary, raising questions about what he had actually been doing on the mountain. Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner went back to Cary's apartment a couple of days after Cary's return to jail. The courts had given him another search warrant.
We felt like we had enough to go back in.
Shane wrote the affidavit, but didn't remember the details when we sat down to talk. I read the warrant back to him, nearly 35 years after he had first written it.
Victims in appearance. So that's essentially the grounds for that second warrant.
Yes.
And you're like, that's all right.
That brings back a little bit of the memory. I haven't seen none of that stuff since then, but that sounds correct.
Safe to say, essentially, you kind of have puzzle pieces that have been scattered on the table for a long time, and now they're starting to click together a little bit.
Yes.
Shane was looking for a few things he had seen in Cary's apartment while serving the first search warrant a week earlier, including Cary's .357 Magnum revolver.
Collected a few items, but nothing earth-shattering. I remember there was a gun, a holster.
Roy City Police Detective Jack Bell once again joined the Ogden cops in Cary's apartment. He found a photo album full of pictures of Cary and his friends, a group some referred to as the Supper Club.
So what was the Supper Club?
It's where he'd have several of his friends over for, quote, dinner and wine, and a couple girls, 1 or 2 girls. And it was what we called in the old days a bunch punch, gang bang, whatever you want to call it. But there was a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, but a couple handfuls of guys involved.
As I understand it from talking not only to Jack, but also some of the people who had attended these get-togethers, the Supper Club was just a group of friends who gathered every once in a while for dinner and drinks. The members each hosted on a rotating basis. This probably started sometime in '86, after Cary Hartmann moved out of the basement apartment on 7th Street. The gatherings fell apart after Cary's arrest. Some of the people I've talked to told me they didn't recall anything sexual going on at those dinners. So Jack may not be accurate in describing the Supper Club as a purely sexual thing. But Jack had reason to believe, from what he saw in Cary's apartment, at least some of Cary's friends had taken part in sexual encounters together. They potentially included business owners, and even a few men and women with close ties to the law enforcement community.
One of them's wife did work for Ogden City, too.
I know some of the names, but I don't know the extent to which they were involved. I did run them by Jack.
You've definitely done your homework, which is good.
Standing there in Cary's apartment, it started to dawn on Jack why so many of Cary's friends had remained silent when Sheree Warren had disappeared.
It's because these friends of his, most all of them married, community ties, businesses, policemen, and all that kind of stuff, have got too much to lose if it all comes out what their connection is.
Jack raided Cary's file cabinet. He found a folder of newspaper clippings about Sheree's disappearance, along with other papers in Cary's handwriting. Jack came across the paper Mary, one of the 2 ladies who had lived above Cary at his old place, had described leaving on his door. It read,
Cary, Kaylin and I would like to tell you how sorry we are that your friend is missing. We all value friends so much, and we feel so sorry that this is happening to you, our friend. If you need anything, please let us know. Good luck, and let's hope for the best.
This boosted Mary's credibility, confirming at least part of what she had told Jack a day earlier.
Now, why didn't they tell us that the first time? I don't know.
Again, it's likely Mary hadn't felt safe coming forward until after Cary was in custody. Jack thumbed through other papers. He saw pages and pages of Cary's notes about his sessions with a palm reader. Cary had dated one set October 9th, 1985, exactly 1 week after Sheree's disappearance.
Gamble with blue-eyed girl. Big change. 2 women. Love affair.
The most interesting bits of this to me were a few pages that appeared to be a question and answer exchange between Cary and the unnamed fortune teller.
Will we find her soon? Not soon. Will we find her with her car? Yes. Is she hurt? Not hurt. She's in good health.
Why is this interesting to me? Cary might have asked these questions in earnest, hoping his fortune teller would help him figure out what had happened to Sheree. If so, these notes could be evidence of his innocence. Or Cary could have just been acting the part of the heartbroken boyfriend in front of the fortune teller in an effort to bolster his alibi.
Did Chuck do it? Yes. Will I get her back alive? Yes. Yes.
Shane worked through the apartment's bedrooms. He was after Cary's clothes to see if any outfits matched those described by the rape victims, or if Cary's boots fit the prints seen outside any of those women's houses. He took 3 red flannel shirts, 4 pair of shoes, a pair of black denim pants, and a downfield jacket.
Like I said, nothing really stood out, but that kind of stuff was taken and seized out of his apartment.
One garment did stand out. It hung in the closet of the apartment's second bedroom, the room Cary's 2 sons slept in when over for visitation on the weekends. It was a women's jacket, gray, and made of suede leather. Jack Bell wondered, could it belong to Sheree?
When we did the search warrant, we found her coat in his closet.
Finding a person's outerwear in their romantic partner's closet is not smoking gun evidence of a murder. But it did raise the question of how did the jacket get there?
Because Sheree had never been in that apartment.
Remember, Cary had moved about a year after Sheree disappeared. If she had left this gray suede jacket at his place on 7th Street, why wouldn't Cary have given it to her family after she disappeared? Why would he have instead packed it up and taken it to his new apartment, then tucked it in the closet where Detective Shane Miner found it while serving the search warrant?
If it's the jacket that she was wearing the day she went to work and last seen, then that tells us that that jacket ended up in Hartmann's apartment.
Okay, so what? Well, if Sheree had been wearing that gray jacket as she left for work from her parents' house on the morning of her disappearance, its presence in Cary's apartment would suggest she had met up with Cary after leaving the credit union office. It would mean Cary lied about not having seen Sheree that night. I told you last episode, this case might just boil down to a tale of 2 coats, Cary's black parka or Sheree's gray suede jacket. Cary had gone out of his way to tell police and his private investigator Sheree had been wearing his black parka that morning, not this small women's suede jacket Detective Shane Miner found in Cary's closet.
So could that jacket have been left at a different time, or was it the jacket she was wearing that morning?
We'll come back to this question in a later episode. The gray suede jacket wasn't evidence in the rape case. It fell outside the scope of the warrant, so the detectives couldn't just take it. Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman would return to get it later with another warrant. Meantime, Detective Jack Bell went to talk to someone whose name he had seen in Cary's papers. Someone he knew, Brent Morgan.
He's my taxidermist. I got a big elk hanging on the wall that he did for me. But at the time, I didn't know Brent knew Cary Hartmann.
You've heard from Brent Morgan already in this podcast.
He had 2 dispositions, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde.
Brent's the taxidermist who had had his wedding on the mountain behind Causey Reservoir a year before Sheree Warren disappeared. Remember, Cary had borrowed money from his girlfriend at the time to buy his ugly yellow truck, saying he needed the pickup to get to Brent's wedding.
Back then, there wasn't a lot of people up there.
At the end of the 70s, a piece of the mountain directly south of Causey Reservoir opened up for development. Brent had been one of the first to buy a lot in the new cabin subdivision called Causey Estates.
What they did when Causey Estates was developed, if you wanted to hunt, you had to buy a permit. So being Lot 89, I was able to secure 5 permits a year.
Brent told me Cary had come to him in September of '85 before the start of the elk hunt with a request. He wanted to borrow Brent's key to the gate at Causey Estates.
He wouldn't have been hunting because he couldn't have got a permit without me giving it to him. I would have had to secure it for him, and that did not happen.
But Brent had agreed to loan Cary his key.
Which I didn't have a problem with at that time because, well, there were other places I could go scouting that I didn't need to be there.
Brent had thought Cary would use the key for a day, then return it. That hadn't happened. By early October, Brent and his hunting party were ready to get on the mountain, but he couldn't get his key back from Cary.
He either doesn't answer or has an excuse. I had to get pretty rude with him because I said, look, you're infringing on what I do.
You only have the one key.
That's correct.
And so, you're basically locked out of your own cabin.
That's correct.
Yeah, that would make... I would be a little frustrated. Do you remember when you got it back?
I don't. I can't tell you exactly when. All I know is it wasn't when I wanted it.
It wasn't until Brent got to chatting with a neighbor a year or so later that he started to wonder what Cary's purpose for holding on to the key might have been.
And then pretty soon, Jack Bell knocks on my door, and I've known Jack almost as long as I've known Cary. And he says, Brent, I don't want you talking to anybody else. I'm on this investigation, so any information from this point forward, I would like you to give it to me.
What went through your mind when he said that?
I'm going, oh, poop, with a little more stringency. But here again, the questions he asked me and the things that, it started making sense.
Jack Bell had also owned a lot in Causey Estates. He told me Brent's story of loaning Cary a key explained how Cary might have gained access to the spot where the elk hunting guide Fred Johns had described encountering him the Sunday after Sheree disappeared.
Yeah. Did he give him the key to go up and go hunting, which we weren't supposed to do. So I found that a little strange, and Brent's usually one that goes by the book.
Jack Bell publicly named Cary Hartmann as a suspect in the disappearance of Sheree Warren in a story published in the Ogden Standard-Examiner the afternoon of Wednesday, May 14, 1987. Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, hadn't been ruled out, but a picture had started coming into focus surrounding Cary's possible role in Sheree's suspected murder.
There's theories, but they're just theories.
Cary's parents had retained a defense attorney for him, who told the newspaper he wouldn't be surprised if prosecutors also charged Cary with murder. But prosecutor Reed Richards wasn't prepared to go that far.
When you have a case where there's no body, the argument that the other side's always going to make, that the defense is always going to make, is you don't know that she's dead. Maybe she found a boyfriend that she decided she wanted to start a new life and took off, and that's why her car was found in Vegas. They took it there and jumped on a plane and went to who knows where.
Cary's parents managed to once again get him out of jail on Saturday, May 16th by putting up their own property as collateral. That same day, Jack Bell and his partner, along with Ogden police detectives Shane Miner and John Stubbs, took a drive through Causey Estates. They headed up top on a twisting dirt road, passing through thick stands of aspen and pine.
It's just really remote. There's a few dirt roads, but other than the dirt roads, you would need a horse to get into some of those areas. Or back then, a lot of people were starting to get these three-wheelers. If you had one of those, you could access some of it, or a horse.
Cary didn't have a horse, but he did own a pair of three-wheelers. So did his friend and fellow former reserve officer Dave Moore.
Did you ever have three-wheelers?
I did. I had two.
Okay.
Jack Bell and Chris Zimmerman went to talk to Dave at his sewing machine repair shop. Dave knew Zimmerman, having rode with him while in the reserves.
Did you know Jack Bell by chance?
I did.
How did you know Jack?
Well, I had a place up at Causey Estates, and he did also.
Okay.
So he was an avid hunter, and so I'd see him up there quite a bit.
Dave told the detectives he had received a phone call the day after Cary's first arrest from Cary's girlfriend, Shauna. That's when he had learned Cary was in jail. David called the jail and asked to speak with Cary. He had come on the line and reportedly said he had done some things he felt ashamed of and would probably lose every friend he had. He had asked Dave to give Zimmerman and Ogden Police Captain Marlon Balls a big hug on his behalf, saying he knew they were just trying to help.
Cary was supposed to go bear hunting with Marlon Balls, Chris Zimmerman, Don Moore, and I think there was about 2 or 3 other Ogden City police officers that were going to go. And after he was arrested, he told me to tell Marlon and Chris that he was sorry, he needed help, and he messed up.
Jack asked Dave what he remembered about the night Sheree disappeared.
What went through your mind when you found out Cary was a suspect in that investigation?
I was completely shocked. I didn't even believe it. Just every time that I'd seen him with her, they got along really good. So it was a shock.
Dave said Cary had stopped into the sewing machine repair shop around 5:30 that evening. David closed up, then headed over to the bar, Sebastian's, with Cary for a couple drinks at 6. Dave couldn't provide Cary an alibi for any time after about 9, when he had left the bar and headed home. He believed Cary had left at that same time, on his way to meet up with Sheree. In the last episode, you heard Cary's statement to the private investigator, which included a different timeline. Cary had claimed he and Dave had met at the bar starting at 9. I showed Cary's statement to Dave.
It's interesting, but it definitely wasn't 9 o'clock.
I asked him what he made of the discrepancy.
It would have been earlier.
It would have been earlier.
Much earlier.
Because you wouldn't have been at the shop at 9 o'clock.
No. I'm not there 10 after 6. Ever.
Man after my own heart.
Yeah. No, definitely not.
In other words, Cary Hartmann had no alibi for the time his former neighbors said they had heard a fight between Cary and Sheree, a thump, then all going quiet. Cary Hartmann returned to court on Wednesday, May 20th. Weber County Attorney Reed Richards argued the bond put up by Cary's parents wasn't enough because their property wasn't worth what they had claimed. The judge kicked the can, delaying his decision for a week. Cary would remain free until then. Cary wrote in his journal that day,
"The judge put the hearing off till the 27th. Reporters were there. Video cameras. The works. Awful."
Jack Bell, meanwhile, was looking for Cary's younger brother, Jack Hartmann. He had arranged to interview Jack, hoping to ask him whether he had been on the mountain behind Causey with Cary the Sunday after Sheree disappeared. But the interview didn't happen.
No, don't think I ever got to talk to Jack.
Jack Bell wrote in his notes, Jack Hartmann's wife had called him to say they wouldn't talk, on the advice of Cary's defense attorney. We're going to hear Jack Hartmann's side of this story in a future episode. At the same time, Ogden police were talking to the Weber County Sheriff's Office about the anonymous caller who had reported finding a body near Causey Reservoir. Ogden detectives were operating on the theory Cary Hartmann had used his borrowed key for the gate at Causey Estates to drive Sheree up that mountain and dump her lifeless body. They suspected the anonymous caller might have stumbled across Sheree almost a year and a half later. But prosecutor Reed Richards couldn't charge Cary with murder based on speculation.
We could have potentially filed charges then, but it was probably 50-50 as to whether we'd even get a bind over with the evidence we had. It was maybe enough for probable cause, but certainly not enough for proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
He urged the detectives to find the body reported by the anonymous caller.
The problem is we didn't have details on who it was that called, so there was no way to go back and find the body that they'd found, which is a little bit odd, too.
The sheriff's office issued a press release inviting reporters from the newspapers, TV, and radio stations to come get a copy of the tape.
I called about Crime Stoppers.
The investigators hoped doing so would nudge the caller into phoning in again.
I'm reporting a body that I found.
KSL5 TV reporter Larry Lewis went to Roy City Police Headquarters the next day.
Yeah, well, he come up to interview me.
This again is former Roy Police Detective Jack Bell, the lead investigator on the Sheree Warren case.
We had talked, and he came up to interview me.
Larry remembers this differently. I'll get to his side of the story in a moment. For now, just know it had been a week since Jack had publicly named Cary Hartmann a suspect in the Sheree Warren case. But Larry hadn't yet reported on that development. So it's plausible Larry could have gone to meet Jack on the basis of doing a story about his friend Cary, the just-released anonymous call tape, or both. But Jack had other ideas. He and Ogden City Police Detective John Stubbs greeted Larry when he arrived.
Larry's name was one of the names of the people involved in this supper club. and I really wanted to talk to him about that.
The supper club was that group of Cary Hartmann's friends who got together at one another's homes for dinner and wine. Jack Bell believed some supper club members engaged in sexual activity together. It's not clear to me today how widespread that was or how many in the group knew about it. Jack needed to determine the nature of all Cary's friendships. He intended to ask Larry some very direct questions.
I told him that he ought to have his helper step out. And he said, well, why? And as I recall, I said, because I got to read you your rights, Larry, and talk to you about Cary Hartmann.
Jack's notes say Larry described having taken Cary's three-wheelers into the foothills east of Ogden on the Saturday after Sheree disappeared. One day before, Fred Johns claimed to have seen Cary and another man with a pair of three-wheelers on the mountain behind Causey.
Yeah, Larry brought that up. Damn, I'm glad I took some notes.
The notes say Larry claimed Cary had told him they didn't need to look for Sheree near Chuck Warren's house because police had already searched there. Jack wrote that wasn't true, and Cary had known it.
Yeah, that's accurate. I'm glad I wrote it down.
I felt a sense of shock reading those notes for the first time because I've met Larry Lewis. I called Larry in January of 2021 while working on season 2 of this podcast. The story of the anonymous caller had also come up in connection with the disappearance of Joyce Yost. I knew Larry had covered the Joyce Yost case, even using a clip of the anonymous call in this 1993 story about the search for Joyce's remains.
A mystery man called dispatchers 6 years ago saying he found a woman's body while hiking in the woods. This is the man's voice.
What it was, I'm reporting a body that I found.
But I'd had no idea at the time of Larry's friendship with Cary Hartmann. On the phone, Larry had told me he didn't remember the Joyce Yost case. I explained the circumstances of the anonymous call and mentioned how he had played the tape in another story, dating back to December of '88.
Investigators believe the body could be that of either Sheree Warren or Joyce Yost, two Weber County women who mysteriously disappeared in 1985 and are presumed murdered.
I even emailed Larry videos of these stories to jog his memory. He replied saying he didn't remember the anonymous caller story at all. So imagine my surprise when Detective Jack Bell told me he had turned the tables on Larry back in '87 when the anonymous call tape first went public.
He didn't do a story that day, and he didn't want to do a story. But I can't imagine how shocked he was.
Larry Lewis didn't ever air a story about Cary Hartmann being named a suspect in Sheree Warren's disappearance, which meant KSL, the company I now work for, failed to bring that story to the public. And Larry didn't report on the anonymous call tape until more than a year and a half after it first went public. I wanted to know why, so I went and knocked on Larry's door.
Hey, is Larry around?
Yeah, Larry.
I carried a microphone, backed up by a TV camera.
Uh-oh.
Now what do we do?
Well, so I don't know if you know who I am. I'm Dave Colley.
Yeah,
we talked about
on the phone
a year ago.
Sure, yeah.
Since that time, I've been working on Sheree Warren and Cary Hartmann.
Okay.
So I need to have a conversation with you about Cary Hartmann.
Oh. Cary Hartmann. Oh.
Cary, yeah.
That name sounds familiar. It's been a long time.
I told Larry I knew he and Cary were friends. Larry instead used the word acquaintances.
So is this being recorded?
It is.
Okay. Oh. I need to know what you're after. I mean, what's the nature of what you're asking?
So basically,
I related to Larry the story Jack Bell had told me about their interview in May of '87. Larry's recollection was quite different from Jack's. He said he hadn't been working on a story that day and didn't recall being read his Miranda rights.
As I recall, I called Detective Bell and said, I know Cary, can I talk to you? Or at least you want to talk to me about him, okay?
I should note, before confronting Larry, I did talk to the videographer he most often worked with during the '80s. The videographer told me he didn't remember being there for this, but it's something he definitely would have remembered. I asked Larry about what I had read in Jack's notes, that Larry had gone on a three-wheeler ride with Cary the Saturday after Sheree Warren disappeared.
I might have. I mean, I did do that. We did do he had 2 three-wheelers, and he came by where I lived, and we took a ride.
Jack Bell's notes say Larry had explained that three-wheeler ride was for the purpose of looking for Sheree's body, even though police at that time had no reason to believe she was dead. But Larry omitted that detail in his conversation with me.
And then the get-together group, the supper club group, you guys didn't talk about that?
I don't know. I don't know. We didn't have I don't call it as a supper club. There were a few people that played poker together, and that was about it. Played poker a couple times.
Okay.
And that was it. Yeah,
Okay. I have Jack Bell on record telling me that there was a group of Cary's friends that he believed you were a part of that got together socially and involved some other activities with some young women.
Right. No, that wasn't me.
Okay.
Poker was it. I knew of what you're talking about, that those other guys did some things. I mean, they had supper and fraternized, but it was without me.
Okay.
Fraternized. So was Larry Lewis just an acquaintance who played poker with Cary Hartmann a few times? Or, as Jack Bell said, was he a good friend of Cary's?
He didn't deny being part of the supper club. He said, I hope this never comes out.
Jack and Larry's accounts don't line up. I'm not sure which is more accurate. You'll have to decide for yourself which you find more credible. For me, learning a KSL TV reporter had a friendship with Cary and was in a position to potentially steer news coverage of the Sheree Warren case left me with some serious questions, like, did Larry ever disclose his friendship with Cary to KSL? Or did he tell anyone he'd been questioned by police in connection with a story he had covered? Jack Bell didn't have the answers.
It's the last time I seen Larry Lewis.
But we'll hear what Larry has to say about this in the next episode. The anonymous call tape remains one of the most frustrating pieces of the Sheree Warren and Joyce Yost cases. Jack and a team of nearly 20 searchers went up to Causey several weeks after the call. They scoured an unnamed canyon to the east of Causey Estates, just over the hill from where Cary's friend Dave Moore owned property.
I personally thought that she was probably dumped in that area, up there on that mountain somewhere.
But they didn't find Sheree. In the years that followed, the anonymous call recording ended up in the hands of a Weber County Sheriff's detective named Rod Layton.
We believed it. I mean, he found a body.
But there is just too much ground to cover.
I thought, I've got to find the caller.
The Utah Department of Public Safety produced a TV spot, complete with reenactment of the discovery. It first aired in December of '89, more than 4 years after Sheree Warren disappeared, 2.5 years after the anonymous call.
The caller stated that he had parked in the Causey Dam area up Ogden Canyon and had hiked 2 to 3 miles back into the mountains. While there, he discovered the decomposed...
Then we started to work. That's when the work started, because we received hundreds and hundreds of calls. I know who this is. This is their voice.
Rod spent years running down these leads. None panned out. The caller never revealed himself. The dispatcher who had taken the call, Shelley Mann, told me she's haunted by it.
How come nobody knows that voice? I don't understand. I think it's so unfair for somebody to call with information and just leave you hanging. They know there's somebody out there, but they're not willing to help you find that person.
Maybe there are reasons for that. Jack Bell told me if Cary Hartmann killed Sheree Warren, the anonymous caller might have been someone who had helped hide her body.
You have to have a reason for calling. You have to have a reason for wanting to be anonymous.
Former prosecutor Reed Richards implied the same.
If somebody's willing to make the call, why wouldn't they follow up and help you find the body? That makes you wonder a little bit.
Especially because Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide who reported seeing Cary on the mountain behind Causey the Sunday after Sheree disappeared, said another man had been there with Cary. To understand why finding a body in the mountains around Causey is so difficult, we need to go back, way back, to October of 1943.
American observers watched the shelling of Nazi positions in Asterno, a town in the path of the American advance in southern Italy.
Newspaper pages were full of stories about the Red Army routing Nazi forces from Crimea, of American Marines battling their way through the Solomon Islands.
Wave after wave reaches the beach.
But the war wasn't the only thing happening in the world. Buried in the local pages of Utah's dailies were a series of stories about a killer snowstorm that had swept across the West during the opening days of the annual deer hunt. It had started with frigid rain, which had turned to wet, heavy snow in the high country. Newspaper stories described a search for a hunter named Rudolph Bertinoli, who had disappeared into the storm in the mountains behind Causey. Bertinoli had gone to join 3 friends at a hunting camp near the top of Gildersleeve Canyon. At some point, he had fallen ill and decided to head home. Bertinoli walked away from camp into the forest toward his truck. The storm lashed the mountain that night. The rest of the hunting party retreated the next morning, but were surprised to find Bertinoli's truck, along with his rifle and gear, still parked on the mountain. Sheriff's deputies and volunteers spent more than a week on foot and horseback, plunging through snowdrifts. They came up empty. Bertinoli had vanished into the aspen and pines, into the cliffs and canyons. 43 years passed before, in April of '86, a cougar hunter following his dogs through the canyon behind Causey entered a small rock alcove. He found human bones sheltered there.
2 femurs, what appears to be part of the pelvis.
Rod Layton was there for the recovery of those remains.
We hiked in. It was about 3 miles. The body was, of course, just bones. We found driver's license. We found boots.
The wallet they found with calendars and a Utah driver's license positively identified the remains as Bertinoli's.
Do you recognize that reporter's voice? That's Cary Hartmann's friend, Larry Lewis. He interviewed Bertinoli's widow.
This is wonderful. This is a relief.
KSL's helicopter, Chopper 5, flew her up the canyon.
I was actually at the site, and I see the KSL helicopter coming back in, and they literally get 10 feet away from the thing. They were right in the middle of the canyon, and they just hovered right there, and she could look right in and said, there it is.
It's believed Bertinoli hiked 2 to 3 days in the snow-covered mountains here, and when he simply couldn't go any further, he looked for the closest shelter. This shallow cave that provided him protection ultimately became the lost hunter's grave.
Bertinoli's name also came up in my conversation with Brent Morgan, the taxidermist who knows that mountain as well as anyone.
Were you surprised that there could have been a hunter's body there for 40 plus years unfound?
Heck yeah, the only reason they found him is it was a lion hunter. If the lion hunter hadn't been following the dogs, they wouldn't have found him then.
Bertinoli had become disoriented.
Got messed up and went the wrong direction. Ended up down on the bottom of Right-Hand Fork.
The Right-Hand Fork is one of the streams that feeds into Causey Reservoir. It flows through an area Brent and his hunting buddies call the Narrows.
Anybody that saw our camp, they say, who are those idiots? Because if you walked out of our tent 10 to 15 feet, it could drop 1,000 feet straight down. They don't call it the Narrows for nothing. It's because it is cliffs.
Few people ever travel that morass of cliffs, plunge pools, and thickets.
The people that are at the Narrows, they're at the top looking down. They're not interested in dropping down where it gets ugly.
I've hiked the Narrows a couple of times myself.
My hiking pace has been really slow because I've had to stay up on these cliffs above the watercourse because of how narrow it is in most places.
The faint trail disappears as the canyon walls close in, leaving you to walk through knee to waist-deep pools of water. Willow branches scrape at you from all sides.
My legs and feet are just stinging right now. Even though I had neoprene socks on and wool underneath, it is cold. My feet are numb. I was stumbly. So not a great situation.
No one's carrying a body back through that canyon. The anonymous caller had to have been referencing a spot up higher, on the slopes above the Narrows, perhaps closer to the ridge where the elk hunting guide Fred Johns spotted Cary Hartmann 4 days after Sheree Warren disappeared. I asked Brent Morgan about getting up onto the mountain above the Narrows. He told me it's private property, and he no longer has access.
Do you miss being able to get up into that part of the...
Is a 40-pound robin fat?
Sometimes I have to ask questions I know the answer to.
Okay, but that's exactly, yeah. When you spend as much time up there as I have with the friends that I cherish and the moments that we had up there, yeah, it's something that's hard to give up. And it's not by choice, it's by access.
Think back to that metaphor, the percent sign that resembles the layout of Causey, Lost Creek, and the mountain between them. The mountain, represented by the slash in the percent sign, is privately owned. Cabin owners at Causey Estates like Brent Morgan, they're not able to access that land like they did during the 80s. Those who hunt that ground now are mostly led by guides who stick close to the road. So if the body reported by the anonymous caller is hidden on the mountain between Causey and Lost Creek, the chance of someone happening across it now seems infinitesimal.
But here again, you get back to the key. If everything was on the up and up, he would have just given me the key. I mean, that is cut and dried right there. There had to be a reason why.
On the next episode of Cold.
It's much better in a murder case to have a dead body than to just be saying she disappeared and we think he killed her. There wasn't really a motive there. Why would you kill your girlfriend? And if you go to trial and don't get a conviction, you're all done.
If you have information about the disappearance of Sheree Warren, now is the time to share it. You can reach me by emailing cold@ksl.com or contact the Roy City Police Department at 801-774-1063. I also want you to know, if you've experienced abuse or sexual violence, you're not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Cold is researched, written, and hosted by me, Dave Cawley. Audio production and sound design by Ben Kiebrick and Aaron Mason. Mixing and mastering by Ben Kiebrick. Michael Bonmiller composed our main theme, with additional music this season by Allison Leighton Brown. Additional voices in this episode provided by
John Green,
Kevin LaRue,
Francis Cook,
and
Kira Hoffelmeyer.
My personal thanks to our editorial team, Amy Donaldson, Andrea Smarden, Ryan Meeks, Becky Bruce, Kira Faramond, Kellyanne Halverson, Josh Tilton, and Felix Bennell. For Amazon Music and Wondery, Managing Producer Candice Manriquez-Wren, Producer Claire Chambers, Senior Producer Lizzie Bassett, and Executive Producer Morgan Jones. Special thanks to Cale Bittner and Allison Vermeulen. With Workhouse Media Executive Producers Paul Anderson and Nick Piniella. And for KSL Podcasts, Executive Producer Cheryl Worsley. For pictures and more, go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and follow us on social at The Cold Podcast. Most of all, thank you for listening.
A few days before Christmas, Janelle Matthews disappeared from her home. There were no signs of a struggle, no eyewitnesses, no DNA recovered. But what if the answer had always been there? What if a true crime fanatic who'd been talking about the case was more than just an obsessive fan? The groundbreaking true crime podcast Suspect is back with a new story that attempts to separate fact from fiction and one man's true crime obsession from a motive for murder.
He says, "Don't fuck with me, Officer Edgerton. I've buried more people than you'll know."
He's providing information that hadn't even been released to the news yet.
At least it's a good liar that he can convince the juror that he wasn't involved.
Follow Suspect wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Prime members, you can binge the entire series ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today.